Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Will Ryan, president of Covenant Theological Seminary. So, we are going to be talking today about his book, This is the Way of Covenant Discipleship. It talks about the gospel, living Christian life, but also like a lot of different things you probably haven't heard about, like different views of hell, the image of God, and the nativity scene, and all these different things that I would just, the typical Christian is probably has a misconceived view of. So I really enjoyed it. Dr. Will Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Zach. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really excited to talk about this book. Most people are already familiar with you because of our past interview that we did on Genesis 1:1 and how to translate that. Can you give us just really brief intro on yourself as well as the book in general?
Absolutely. Um, First, I just want to say I love your channel on YouTube. I love what you're doing. I love it that you're somewhat connected to CTS and have a lot of different irons in the fire. And we think a lot the same. And so I'm just excited again to be here again. Thank you for having me. I, as you mentioned, am the president of Covenant Theological Seminary. That is a non-denominational, not connected with covenant theology or anything like that. It's grounded in North Carolina, but we are a global school. In 2020, we decided to go completely online, which means that a student, if they would like, can complete everything online. They never have to go to a location. But with that said, we do have 30 locations around the world, brick and mortar locations. We also have several different other ministries that we partner with. Altogether, CTS is about 20,000 students strong. I've been connected with CTS for about 8 years now. I started teaching Hebrew there and then became the head of theology and biblical studies, where I kind of hung out for about 6 or 7 years. And then last year, I became the president of the seminary. And I'm also um, the co-host of Expedition 44, which is a YouTube channel that talks about. We go really in depth on different theological ideas, doctrines, things like that. Zach, you've been a part of that a little bit here and there, and so Dr. Matt Musakis is the other co-host of that, and we've got series on Revelation. We're in the middle of a huge thing on the church right now. We've been over a year. I think we're at part 19 on the church right now. We've taken breaks and done interviews with speakers, authors, things like that as well. I live in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. I've got four boys. Right now, they're aged 11 through 17, and so they're in just a super exciting time in life. This summer, we've been to the Boundary Waters, fishing, canoeing. We have been rock climbing about every other weekend. We're way into fishing every night. So I've had a very busy summer already. As you know, today we're talking about this is the way. I'm going to have to get my, there we go. And this is the first book in the series. I'm more known as an author, I guess, or little known as an author for writing forewords of theologians and authors and things like that. But I wanted to dive into this series, and it's a three-part series. So this is the first one that we're talking about today. It's This is the Way of Covenant Discipleship, and it's really geared at really everybody, but it's mostly geared at people that have sort of been Christians most of their life and kind of gotten to a place where they're ready for more, or they might be stagnant. And so it's kind of, a challenge to re-look at the way you've considered your Christianity, your calling, things like that, and to get on a more serious road with what God might be asking you to do. The second in the trilogy series is supposed to be released any day on Amazon. It's traditionally published like the first one through Crosslink Publishing, and it will be called This is the Way of Covenant Community, and it takes a deeper look into really what it means once you've decided to live as a disciple to how you act that out. And then the third one is sort of geared at what it looks like to live a longer life of complete discipleship, and I would sort of say uh, cultivating in a complete image of Christ, sort of the biblical call to be an elder. So that's everything. My life, these books in a nutshell.
You won't be able to get the book, signed in a nice little letter in Hebrew from him, but you can get it online, and I would highly recommend it. It's really good stuff. So let's dive into the book. So, different views on hell. You got a really, really great chapter on that, which it takes a lot to uh, for me to learn more. And your book provided that specifically on this topic. There's a couple of views that I never really even considered. Can you talk about what you talked about in that chapter on hail and lay out the different views for us?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you're jumping right into the part on the book about hell because, as you know, it's chapter 10. It's all the way curled in at the end of the book. And I probably get more questions on what I wrote about hell than anything else. And what's interesting is when I started writing this book, I kind of had a group of theologians that I said, hey, can you kind of be a sounding board that I can run past you some ideas for this? And so we kind of storyboarded the book and talked about, if this is what the book's going after, is rethinking your spiritual commitment and what God is calling, what are some of the things that you actually need to rethink? And we had a whole list of them. There are about 20 of them. We tried to narrow it down to 10. And hell is such a big topic for most
Mhm.
people. And I think this was dwindling around like 15 to 20 on our list. And I wasn't even going to include it definitely in the first book. And I went back. It was actually a later revision. The first revision I gave to the publisher, it wasn't even in there. And I went back and I added it. I think it was Dr. Matt, who at the time wasn't a doctor. We were talking to Chris Date. We did an interview with Chris Date, Rethinking Hell. And at the end of the interview, Matt said something like, I had no idea like you were that into the study of hell. He's like, some of the stuff you were talking about, like I've never heard before. And this is a guy that's, neck deep into theology, and just said like, you really need to like write down some of those thoughts because it was more succinct than I think anybody's ever heard it presented. And so that was the goal of adding a chapter 10, was to try to come up with a very succinct, biblically based theological view on hell. Because as you alluded to, most Christians sort of grow up in their church, in their Christianese setting, really not knowing that the Bible might have different ideas or different views. And this is going to kind of get into a lot of your thoughts on theology. And Zach, I like it that most of your listeners, watchers are going to have a significantly more in depth understanding of the Bible. I don't necessarily want to get into inerrancy and things like that in this discussion, but there's an understanding that perhaps we're interpreting what the Bible says, and there's more than one good view on that subject. And
Hmm.
so, um, you might have heard something presented one way further, and honestly, a lot of times people that have grown up in the church, they don't even really know or have a separation or a lens to consider different theologies. They just sort of hear the words that come along with them, and sometimes they get that and sometimes they don't. And so one of the goals of chapter 10 on hell was to break down the different understandings that people would read the scripture with, what does this idea of hell or this concept look like, and where does it fit in? And so I call it hell, but it's really more of, a judgment thinking, or what happens in the afterlife or something like that. And so, being an Old Testament person, if you just simply read the Old Testament, you wouldn't really know what to do with this kind of idea of what happens when you die. Is there a
Hmm.
judgment? Is there a place that you go? Is there a reincarnation? Is there a heaven, something like that? And there's obviously I talk about heaven a little bit in the book as well too. But there's basically one major view on hell. And when you kind of get into what the views are, you kind of read chapter 10, and it breaks things out a little bit, and then it goes through the different versions of it. And the first one I would call traditionalism is eternal conscious torment. And that's really what most churches, I would say, probably continue to teach. And it's your classic or traditional view of hell. Of, we've all been in, I think, situations where you've heard an altar call at the end of church, or something like that. Maybe even somebody with a sign on a street corner, or something that comes off like that, where you kind of are entered into the idea that when you die, there's likely going to be a judgment before the Lord. Some people question that, but in most evangelical Christianity, you're just going to accept that you're going to stand before the Lord, and you're going to have to answer for the way that you lived your life. And however this judgment or report card or grading goes, you're at the point where you read it, and then you understand, from here I either get a whole lot of crowns or something like that, or there might be another way to go. And if there's another way to go, if you didn't make the cut, so to speak, what does that look like? Is there more grace? Is there more mercy? Something like that. So in the Old Testament, if you were purely just reading the Old Testament, you wouldn't necessarily come up with a modern view of hell that we get. Now you get some of this in, reading the Old Testament or ancient works, that you can kind of see that there were some people that were cast down to the lower areas and things like that. But I'm going to keep this pretty brief. I'm already getting a little long-winded, but eternal conscious torment would basically be the idea. And again, even people that would say ETC is the abbreviation for this, people that go ETC or ECT, sorry, would believe that when you die, you're going to be judged. If you're not found worthy, you'll be cast into some kind of brimstone or fiery place, the eternal lake of fire. And most ECT people are going to view that as literal. Not all of them, but a lot of them are going to view that as literal. And there you will kind of have a forever gnashing of teeth. And whether you view this or you formulate it as sort of a understanding that you're pain for what you've done on earth, or that you're being tormented or tortured for what you've done, or something like that. There's an idea that you're sort of getting what you deserve as
Hmm.
you're cast into this lake of fire. And like I said, there's different understandings, but most people that go this way would have that forever sense, or eternal or everlasting words that go along with that.
Hmm.
And then the torment is going to usually be thought of in terms of real torment, physical pain, anguish, things like that. And boy, we could jump really far into this, but as most of this interview goes, I'm just going to kind of point it back to the book to get there. And the goal of the book was really just to be an overview of it, to give you a proper foundation that you can dive much deeper into the understanding. So ECT, that's the first view. I think that's the one that most of us are kind of familiar with. Zach, I mean, you know quite a bit about this view. Do you want to add anything to that, or any more questions going that road before I open up the
Nope.
next one?
Keep going on.
All right. So the second one, um, and this is the one that I sort of tend to fall a little bit more, is conditionalism or annihilation. Sometimes it's called, and I guess, and again with this view, there's different viewpoints, and so I don't want to put everybody in a box. I want to be
Right.
careful not to do that. That you can consider yourself a conditionalist and have different thoughts in this area, but I'm going to say the very basic idea of it is that when you read passages that going to say that you simply die, that that's what it means, that death is death, that it's an ending of everything. And little Susie that, maybe heard a gospel presentation in her little, African village, and then walks around the corner when she's 8 and gets hit by a bus. What happens to her? Does she be tormented forever and ever and ever? I think that's one people have a hard time with. And so a conditionalist would say that no, she simply just ceases to exist. In God's grace and mercy, God's just going to give her a forever ending to that. And then there's all kinds of in betweens, of different variations of this. And, you kind of get this back in ECT too, of maybe it's not a forever state, or maybe there's still another chance to kind of circumvent and end back up in the gates of heaven. And that kind of thinking goes back to the Revelation verse that the gates are never closed. And so there's some kind of things going back there. But what most conditionalists, or people that kind of fall into the annihilation camp, the reason they do that is there are so many verses that simply say that death is death, that it's the ending of everything, that if you don't make the cut, this is where it's going to be. And most people would also say that that fits the character of God better. Kindness, compassion,
Hmm.
in Exodus 34, and God introduces himself. That's the way he introduces himself. Yet, if you're an ECT person, the version of what God is doing looks very opposite of that. And so a lot of times a traditionalist is going to say that this is watering down hell, that you're almost removing hell, because if somebody just sort of dies, then why would you even need, or why would there be a place called hell? Well, the simple answer to that is obviously when the lake of fire was created. If you know anything about hell, you know that it was really created for the spiritual beings that had fallen or rebelled against God to be cast into those places. We
Hmm.
often call those demons. But then in Revelation, there's this little verse that says, and now some of the other, you might call them degenerates, or those that did not follow the Lord, are also going to be thrown into that same chasm or lake of hell. Now, Revelation is apocalyptical. There's also some of these things in Matthew. On Expedition 44, we have a huge, I believe it's a 10-part series just on hell, where we go into every little part of this. And to be frank, we get way more in depth in our Expedition 44 interview, in our videos, than we do even in the book. The book, again, is really just introductory, and kind of
Hmm.
sort of explains the very basic ideas of this for people that have never understood or known that there's another one. Now, what I like about this the most is that I can't tell you how many people in life I've known that are Christians, and they've walked away from the faith. And when they walk away from the faith, you ask them, and it's almost always something theologically directed, and it's often the view of ECT hell that they didn't understand. They just thought this is what the Bible teaches. They didn't
Hmm.
understand that there are different views or different ideas that the interpretation could be, and that you don't necessarily have to believe that God is going to, sort of torment people forever. That within a evangelical view of the Bible, you could take a different view on all these verses to say that God is simply just going to end their being or their life. And that's the idea of annihilation. And like I said, there's different versions of it. And so some people are going to, kind of put the timeline at different places, or say what happens, or, maybe even, look at it and say, will there be a chance for them to hear another gospel message, at the pearly gates or something like that, before that happens. All of these things theologically, and I use this statement a lot, we don't have all the cards for it in the Bible. You can study the Bible till you're blue in the face, and you can come up with a great lens of your theology or what you think the Bible says, but there are so many things in the Bible that we just don't have. And my book brings this out that, this is sort of like Zach, this is way before your time. Sorry, I'm going to date myself. But
Okay.
one of the first movies I just loved, and I'm still into it, was Star Wars. And the very first Star Wars, you're walking into this, and there's this Darth Vader guy raiding this thing, and you have no idea what's going on. It's because those of you that know the Star Wars story, you're not starting at the beginning, you're reading the middle of this whole saga that's going on. You're watching the middle movie, and years later, what are there, like 20 some versions of Star Wars now, from the beginning, before and after that
Yep.
particular movie? Now we get more of it. But when we read our Bible, it's the story of God's love to redeem what was broken and bring us back into that plan. But there's a whole lot of other stories that it probably alludes to that we just don't have the whole books for. And I,
Hmm.
I kind of joke that someday I think we're going to sit with the Lord, and we're either going to watch those movies, or we're going to be living them out, or part of them, or we're going to have the cliff notes to them at least, or the books or the scrolls or something like that. So there's a lot that we just don't simply get, and I think that hell is one of the topics that falls into that. And in some ways, like so many things in theology, it almost doesn't matter. I mean, if you follow the Lord in the way that the book describes it, we should be live in complete devotion, be all in for the Lord, be disciples. It's really not going to matter what you think of your concept of hell, because you're not going to be affected by it when you get there.
Hmm.
And so I tend to fall on the conditionalist side of things, because I if I had to give you one reason, I have a lot of reasons, and I sort of outlined some of them in the book and a lot of them in our videos. But I have two reasons that I typically go that way. The one is because the first and foremost is I believe that when you read who God is, and you read the character of God over and over from the beginning pages to the end pages of the Bible, the understanding of a view like conditionalism fits that character and fits the covenant promises that God gives us better than a view of ECT.
Hmm.
Um, the other reason why I think I go that way is because I think that the view of ECT has, even though I would really say it's still a strong view, like if Zach, if you hold to the view of ECT after you've studied this, I'm not going to give you a hard time for that. Like I would call that a good view. People, in fact, people have held to this as the primary view of hell for hundreds of years at least. And I mean, if you ask any church person to tell you about hell, they're going to describe most likely an ECT view of hell. But I have the hardest time with that view, particularly in that I don't believe that it really lines up with the character of God the best. And then the second reason I have a hard time with it is because when I really study the scriptures and I break each one of them down one by one, and this is what we do in our video, when I look at it in terms of textures of analysis, or I go through and I say I'm going to interpret this with like almost a fine-tooth theological, I won't say scientific, although most people would understand it better if I said that. I'm going to go through with a hermeneutical approach that I'm going to apply to the same thing. I truly believe that the scriptures speak more towards conditionalism than they do to an ECT view. Now, I'm also going to say that I might hold a rare view that I think different writers, or um, definitely different scholars, are going to have different views on this thing. So I think it's very possible that you get to the John of the Bible might have interpreted things slightly different than Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or later Paul is going to interpret. And
Hmm.
so, again, that's a whole nother conversation that we can get into later, but I believe some of that's going on. So, those are probably the two most popular views of hell. In fact, I would say almost everybody I know is really going to fall into one of those two views. And I would say a lot of the more educated, more scholarly Christian people. So I represent CTS, and I would say a large contingency of CTS, in terms of the theologians, are going to go conditionalist rather than ECT.
Hmm.
Or if they do go ECT, they're just going to have kind of a, we don't know all the answers. We can't quite figure out exactly how this is. We're just going to have faith. But I think most of those would say there's too many verses in the Bible that kind of seem to speak to this kind of torment, that it can't just be a simple passing away. There at least has to be a period of where you're sort of paying for
Hmm.
those things, where you're suffering or enter into a sense of what we would think of as a judgment scene. So that's, if I was going to say that, that's what makes the annihilation case more difficult for some people. That's where it would be.
Hmm. Okay. So basically, to summarize, you're saying that when you read the Bible, we come to these views of hell and all these other theologies based on individual verses, a collection of them most often. And when you look at like individual verses for like, you know, whatever, the lake of fire or like gnashing of teeth or something like that, and you say, okay, so this idea of gnashing of teeth, it can fit under this view, annihilation, or even eternal conscious torment, or maybe even other views, and you don't specifically see a specific reason why it has to go either way, and therefore when you look at all these different texts and it's like it could go either way on that one, and then you think of, okay, well, our picture of God fits a lot better on annihilationism, conditionalism than it does these other views. That's why you lean that way. Is that a good way to sum up?
I think that sums it up pretty good. And again, like we could talk for hours, and we could do a 4 hour video just talking about that one specific thing of why I think that way. But I
Yeah.
guess to sum it up, some people have never considered this before, but when we think of the worst person that's ever walked the planet before, I mean, who do you think of? I mean, most people go to Hitler, right? Why do you think Hitler was so bad? It's because he secretly had this agenda to wipe people out. So what is he doing? He's putting them all on a train. He's busing them to a gas, camp. He's lining them all up downstairs, closing it all up, and releasing the gas, and people basically fall asleep and they never wake up again. And because he does that to millions of people, and then also sometimes before they get there, he puts them in concentration camps in which they're not being fed or cared for properly, but they're not necessarily being, I mean, I think some of them we would say are being, abused or tormented, but I'd say the great majority of them we wouldn't actually define it as necessarily torment. They're just not being fed. They're just not being treated as humans. And
Hmm.
so this is the person that we would say is the worst person to ever exist, because they've done that to so many other people. Yet under an ECT view, you sort of have to put God in a worse position than that. You
Hmm.
have to say that what God is going to do is, in the extreme situations of the little Susie I said that's never heard, little Susie is going to end up swimming in a lake of fire and torment and gnashing of teeth forever and ever and ever.
Hmm.
That's way worse than what Hitler did. That makes what Hitler did sound really mild. So how can you take the God of the Bible, who describes himself as kindness and compassion over and over and over, love, grace, mercy, all of these things, and put him in a picture that looks far worse than the worst person that we can think of?
Hmm.
It just, to me, you gotta, that's going to be the hardship to come up with that view, is to try to work through that a little bit. So that's some of the difficulties of both views a little
Hmm.
bit. Like I said, there is a third view which is getting a little bit more received. The third view is universal reconciliation, and I want to just be careful with this, because usually if I were going to say, if I came to you, Zach, and I said, "Hey, I became a universalist last week," you would be like, "Wait, what?" most people call that plurality. The all roads lead to heaven.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
that's a little bit different than universal reconciliation. Universal reconciliation is what I would call a biblical view that you can come to just reading the Bible, where you would understand that at some point everybody is going to be given a chance either during this life or after this life to accept the message, the gift that God's going to give them, and is some way going to find their way into heaven. And so, at first, that does sound a little bit like pluralism. That are you saying you can believe anything you want on this earth and get to heaven? Well, sort of, but eventually you're going to have to believe in the truth that God gives you, and you're going to come to a reconciliation that there is only one God, and this God and Yahweh is the one. And so, what does that look like? Well, again, this is variances in that view. I can kind of tell you the most common one that, in the Old Testament, you get this idea that they weren't evangelizing,
Hmm.
that in fact Israel was told the exact opposite. Do not intermarry, do not go to those places. In fact, in terms of the Canaanites, wipe them out, and this is what God wants. But then you get these weird things when they're wiping out the Canaanites, how they're sort of burying them, but then they're sort of speaking to them as if they still want them to come back and be their brothers. Now, maybe their understanding of the afterlife is limited when you read some of that stuff, and you sort of have to read between the lines that they're sort of, they're sort of dedicating them for this. But then you get stories, and if you know anything about the Apostles' Creed, one thing people struggle with is, Christ perhaps descending into hell during his 3 days after the cross before the resurrection. And what is he doing? And you get these Matthew 25 stories again, or things like that of Abraham's bosom, chasms between the good and the bad people. Does Jesus go back and preach to the people in the Old Testament, holding that they might be given another chance? And if that's true of the Old Testament, is it going to foreshadow what will also be true in the New Covenant? And again, you can study this and answer it one way or a different way. But there's several scriptures that are going to make this sound better. And again, one of them is that the gates will always be open. And so in this understanding, perhaps we all die and we go to a place of sleeping or holding. We are going to go to judgment at some point, and then there's there another chance. And again, this is where ECT sometimes sort of binds in with universal reconciliation, because there's some people that would believe as universal reconciliation that then you're thrown into the lake of fire, where there's sort of a preaching, and when you're ready to declare Jesus as Lord, you come out of the fire, and maybe the gates are still open for you. And so that's one version of that kind of thinking or understanding
Hmm.
a little bit. So my problem with this view is that there's way too many scriptures that just seem to make this not in line with what I would say other scriptures might say. Now, you could say different biblical writers thought of it differently, and perhaps this is the way one writer thought of it, where another writer thought of it that way. We definitely get that into extra biblical sources in the Second Temple period. We hear
Hmm.
some people say, no, this is the way it is, others say this is the way it is, and you can read way more about that. And I think that's why right now we kind of have three different views on it. Early church was definitely having these conversations. If you read the founding forefathers, you'll get a lot of this. And so you can read some of this, but I would say, wouldn't this be great, Zach? I would say to you, like, is is it possible that God wants everybody to come to him? I mean, doesn't the Bible say that God wants everybody to come to him? Do you believe that God has the power that everybody could come to him? And the answer of that is, if you believe God is omnipotent, then yes, you believe God does have the power. Now, this gets into, well, does God make a order, a system of algorithms that people kind of have to fall into? Maybe again, that's a multi-part video on its own, I think. But but I would call myself a hopeful universal reconciliationist because the idea of it sounds great. I have loved ones that are never going to come to Jesus on this planet. I mean,
Hmm.
I certainly hope and pray that they do, but I'm pretty sure that they're not. I would love it if there were another chance, and I would really love it if everybody at some point in the afterlife came to a point where they ended up in a sense of presence of God in heaven or a recreated heaven and earth.
Hmm. Very interesting. Okay. All right. And you mentioned maybe one or two, or maybe even three other ones. Specifically, I want to get your thoughts on the Eastern Orthodox view. That's something that I
Yeah.
hadn't heard of before. Can you talk about that?
I would not consider myself an expert by any means on this one. And this is the one that is the most out of the box, several different views. In fact, if you know three people that consider themselves to have an orthodox view of hell, they're all going to have a different opinion on this one. So, where ECT, I mean, for the most part, everybody
Yeah.
that holds ECT pretty much thinks of the same thing. Where the Orthodox view of hell, boy, it's out there. Now, I will say that most people have an understanding of this more than they think they do. And if you look at writings in the past, you're going to get this. C.S. Lewis, although I would say did not hold an orthodox view of hell, in a lot of his writings, you're going to see some of those ideas come up. Another view of this is going to sort of be the different layers of hell. You hear that with like Dante and things like that sometimes. And so I'll just kind of explain a very simple version of it again, and I'll call this a generic version that some people might even argue with my generic version of it. But the idea is all about proximity to God. How close are you to God? And
Hmm.
so the thought pattern would be sometimes it's described as jewels that we might attain to, sometimes it's described in the Bible as intimacy. But the goal through the life here on this earth is that we might become disciples, becoming more intimate in our own relationship with the Lord and bring others into that intimacy. And it seems like as we walk that way and we bring others to walk that way, that's where the jewels might come in as we bring others into it, that's going to sort of win us or gain us something in the final look of heavens or recreated heaven and hell. And
Hmm.
so, or heaven and earth. And so what it could gain us is the place or the sacred space, the proximity to God. And so in the Bible, things are really talked about as circles. And if you get into a lot of our Expedition 44 stuff, you'll see that one of the things Matt and I really have a hard time with is the modern day pulpit is kind of elevated in front of everybody, and then these rows everybody sits in, and you're entertained by the one gift for a while. I don't have a lot of major problems with it, but it doesn't really give a very biblical idea. When you read the Bible, everything is circular. And so you kind of have God at the center and everything rotates around that. And so when you think about that perspective in an ideal heaven, you're going to have God perhaps at the very center, and then the people who have more jewels or who had more of an intimate relationship with God are sort of going to be seated more like the right hand of God. You're going to be closer in proximity, and it goes further and farther away. You're going to sort of get the idea of light and darkness. As you go further and further away, you're going to be more, you know, dimly lit from the radiance of God in the middle. And so when you get to the outsides and you talk about hell, what that means, whether it's separated by a chasm or darkness or some people something like that, there's going to be a sense of some people are almost sitting with their back towards God saying, I don't want this. And maybe they're so far away from the light that it's a cold place, or
Hmm.
that they're just milling in their anguish because they found out that they were wrong, that there is a God or something like that. So the whole idea of orthodox understanding of God is that you might be miserable because your mindset is in a place that you've separated yourself from God,
Hmm.
where the next person is going to be turned towards the radiance of God. And even if they didn't do a very good job of following the Lord. They might be a long ways away, but they got their hands outstretched like that, and they're longing to be in the radiance or in the image or in the view or in the space of God, and they're going to try to walk closer that they can. And in this idea, there might be a way that at some point that person on the remnant, on the way outside, you know, spire, is going to get up and change their mind and say, you know what, I've been wrong. I want to be closer to God. And perhaps even in a recreated heaven and earth, there's going to be a chance for them to bring themselves closer to that radiance of the Lord. So it's sort of sacred space proximity to the holiness of God.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. Okay. So, uh, could you briefly mention any other views, just really briefly? I don't think it's worth going that detail over of the other
Yeah.
views that you mentioned.
Yeah, there are
Just real quick.
several other views, and I even have a hard time putting a word to what these views are or a title to what the views are, because when you get outside of like these three or four major views,
Hmm.
things are going to take on some really interesting dynamics. And this is sort of where you might start getting into the what people would call heretical. Now, what I just said is really important, that according to most of history, all four of these views that we've discussed were mainstream understandings. You didn't get burned at the stake because you were a conditionalist. You had to go even more abstract than that to be considered a heretic. And even though there are instances of people being called heretics throughout the last several thousand years for taking on one of those views, they're very few and far between. And so I would say the better understanding today is that if you fall within one of those four views, it's you're not going to be in a heretical place. Now, again, some people are going to challenge me on this, especially when you get into orthodoxy, because orthodoxy, as you know, Zach, has a couple different definitions. And
Sure.
so you were you were sort of careful to kind of preface your orthodox view when you asked me the question. But some people are going to kind of think of the orthodoxy as a very Trinitarian view, and going to say, well, it has to be the idea of renouncing, everything that you are and following the Lord here on this earth. And I would challenge that view of orthodoxy, even though that's what a lot of people would say.
Hmm.
I would say that these four views are going to be throughout history viewed as the normal views. And then when you get outside of these four views, you're going to get into some out there, and this is where you might there is a sense of Christian reincarnation. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or not, but you kind of get into that. You're also going to get into some other stuff, but I would say the rest of the views have to sort of do some theological gymnastics with some things in the Bible to really make them work. So I don't even really feel comfortable necessarily listing them all, but I would. There are some books out there on them, and I would say there's about another six views outside of those four that you could kind of fall into, and they do have different ideas or different parts, and sometimes they encompass different parts of all four of those views to come up with their own view. And so they might not be heretical, they might just encompass different parts of it. And I
Hmm.
kind of got into that a little bit when I said, if you're universal reconciliation that believes that you might end up in a lake of fire for a little while, well, does that mean you're more ECT or more universal reconciliation? You wouldn't fall into either camp. You sort
Yeah.
of fall into your own camp at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Something really fun that I learned in my interview with Chris Dade is that the between the Old and New Testament, you have a lot of Jewish writers that are writing, and some of the time it's very clear that it's annihilationism. Sometimes that it looks like it could be internal conscious torment, like your typical view of hell. But and then a lot of times it's like it's mixed, and they have like it's like which one exactly is it?
Were
And
they confused? Were they
yeah,
arguing about it? We again, we don't
yeah,
have that book. There might be a movie where they're punching each other out or something like that for different views, but we don't have it if that's
yeah.
in it. And I can't wait whenever this happens, whether it's recreated heaven and earth or just when I get to heaven. right out of my death. I can't wait to find out the answers to some of
Hmm.
this. But it's
Yeah.
also occurred to me that, perhaps that's still some of the mysteries of the heavens as well.
True. Okay, so are you good to? I think that maybe we have just enough time for maybe we can just talk about the gospel. I'd like to dive into that. Is that good with you?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So there's a lot of different thoughts on the gospel,
Hmm.
and that's chapter 7 in my book, and it's been influenced by quite a few people. But as you know, everything with me starts with Eden, and I would say it ends with Eden, and it all has to fit within the whole lens of the Bible. And so I don't get it at all when people say, they're a New Testament person, or, you hardly need the Old Testament, or we're not bound to any of that stuff anymore. Why would you want anything to do with it? And so from the very beginning pages of the Bible to the end pages of the Bible, I would say that the gospel is multifaceted. That it
Hmm.
means more than what you probably always thought it meant or heard that it meant. It's more than just coming to Jesus. It's more of just evangelism. I think most of the
Hmm.
time today, when you say, I'm going to present the gospel, people get this idea of evangelism.
Yeah.
And Matthew Bates, Salvation by Allegiance Alone, Rethinking Faith, Works, and the Gospel, Jesus the King. I would say right now it's probably the best work in this area. I make a quote at the beginning of this chapter to that book. And if you want to read and know more about it, that's probably the best way to kind of go that route. But in my book, and I don't know if you guys might figure this out, but there's actually a two versions of the book that we're talking about today. There's the first edition and there's a second edition, and the one that Zach and I both have is the second edition. And on this one, it's on page, there you go, 59. Thank you. The bottom of page 59 goes into a small three-paragraph section, and I'm just going to kind of reiterate what it says here because I think that sums up the chapter very well. But just kind of opening it up, it says the gospel isn't a momentary decision of salvation, although salvation is a large part of it. It isn't simply forgiveness of sins, although repentance uh, is a part of it as well. It isn't defeating the fallen spiritual beings or the Satan figure, although them being bound is part of that victory. It isn't about going to church, but the church is the bride of the word. It isn't even just the great announcement of the forever king, although all these things would culminate and bring life through that king. It isn't merely allegiance, but this kind of soul allegiance is necessary, and without it, the gospel wouldn't be found. It comes down to the complete plan of covenant, eternal life with God in his sacred kingdom. And so when I look at what is the gospel, it was the plan that everybody should enter into devout discipleship with the Lord. And that if you're not in that plan, you should desire to bring everybody else in your circle into that same plan as well. And so that encompasses all of those different things. And you're going to see this, or you're going to get it throughout all of scripture. I mean, even going back to Eden, and you look at Adam and Eve, and what their plan was to do to bring order and to perhaps bring people into that cultivating covenant with the Lord. That's what I would say their plan was. That's what the gospel was from the very beginning of the pages. After Israel is instated, and they're supposed to go into the promised land and win back Canaan. Well, the plan was that eventually they would enter into relationship with those around them, and they would look so good that everybody would want to also get what they had, and eventually everything might be reclaimed. And that reclaimed, if you kind of follow a Deuteronomy 32 perspective, would be that all was lost at some point, all was handed over to the powers of the fallen, principalities, authorities, Satan, the head person over the top of them, that we're going to kind of get to in the New Testament. And that the plan is that all might be regained or reclaimed. Now, Israel was supposed to be that that new nation of a priesthood to reclaim what was lost, but they never get there. And eventually they're handed over in the same way. They're scattered in the diaspora, and there needs to be a new plan. And then the plan becomes Jesus coming, giving his life for us so that we have this new covenant. And now the plan is that you and I might be those New Testament, New Covenant priests, agents to bring everybody back into that. And so, that whole plan, what are we doing? We're bringing people back into a lost relationship with Jesus. And
Hmm.
that, I think, probably sums up the whole picture of the gospel the best, is reinstating what you were designed to do, which was to have a relationship with other covenant people in
Hmm.
your circles and God himself.
That no, that's a really interesting way to put it because as you mentioned, it's often in my past, it's often seen as like, hey, this is what you give to someone you witness to or whatever. Hey, you want to become a Christian, tell them all the stuff they did wrong and
Right.
how God's going to fix that so they don't get to go to hell. And that's like really interesting. You miss a lot of the biblical story that way.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, what role does forgiveness play in this gospel?
Boy, that's $1 million question. It's really interesting in an Old Testament perspective. You don't necessarily get the idea that you have to be forgiven. And boy,
Hmm.
people aren't going to like it that I just said that. You get the idea that something needs to take place, whether you're going to call this atonement or a sacrifice
Yeah.
or kapar language or whatever it might be. We could talk about the purpose of animal sacrifices and the picture that Jesus is going to do that, but it really comes down to atonement. And so when we fall out of God's graces with him, when we give ourselves to the world basically, or we're won by the world. I haven't quite figured out exactly how we all get to the world. I don't necessarily pin it on Adam like Reformed theology does, but I would say that we are all the worlds. When we come into the world, we sort of belong to the world because of what was lost in Eden, and we need to be won back or regained. And so
Hmm.
the idea of being won back or regained is coming back into the presence of God and being found favorable, that we might be accepted back into that. And something has to happen for that to happen, and it's called atonement. That what separated us from God has to be taken care of. Now, I actually don't even like that separation language, but I'm using it because that's what most people are familiar with. And so does it need to be covered? Does the gap need to be, brought closer, something like that? Well, again, I'm just going to say the book introduces you to a better way of thinking about this. We've also got a whole series on atonement that is probably our number one viewed series. It's
Hmm.
got thousands and thousands and thousands of views, and we get more questions on that series than anything else. And
Hmm.
so it really dives into what are the different ways to view atonement, and the simple question of where does forgiveness fall into all of this thing. We definitely are forgiven. I mean, the Lord is very clear in his word telling us that we're forgiven, but it's also clear that we should be living in forgiveness. We should
Huh.
be purified, we should be clean, and that goes back to the Old Testament purification
Yeah.
language, that if you're going to live holy, you need to live clean. You need to live close, or maybe I might even use proximity language. You need to live in a way where you're closely resembling the image of God. And if you don't do that, you're living defiled. And so whether you go back and you frame it like the Old Testament does, I'm an Old Testament guy, so I frame everything in the Old Testament, or you go to the New Testament and you're going to, frame this more in terms of just living your life in a way that is wholly devoted to the Lord, it means that you're going to live according to his word. An Old Testament person, say, would live by Torah. A New Testament person is going to say you're gonna look like Jesus. What would Jesus do? That's what you want to do in every situation. There's no room for all these sins to continue in your life. You need to have victory and live a proclaim redeemed life that you have been freed. That's Exodus motive language, that you've been delivered from those things and they're no longer part of you, but you are free from them. And now that God has uh, washed away, you might say, God has covered, God has proclaimed, given victory over those things through his atonement, his work of sacrifice. And what is that? Well, it's whatever God says he needs. What That's the $1 million question, I mean, God could have held up a crayon and said, break this crayon, that's all I'm asking. But God needs something, and we don't know why he needs something, why we can't immediately just be connected. That's the whole thing that surrounds the cross, and why there are at least 7 or 8 or 12 different views of atonement. Was there a spiritual war that was won, like a Christus Victor view?
Huh.
Was there a debt that had to be paid, and if so, was it paid to God or back to Satan or whatever? I mean, was there blood that had to be made pure in this thing? That's what you're going to get into. The book introduces you to all these different ideas. I mean, I could just talk about the blood all day long, but that's going to get into, I can't do that. And that's one that I tell preachers sometimes, like when people are learning at CTS, there's some things that you shouldn't just say from the pulpit without giving a sermon on them. And one of them might be, um, Abraham when he's going to sacrifice his son. Like, if you just make that illusion,
Yeah.
people are not going to understand how God can do something like that. You need to tell the whole story.
Hmm.
And the blood just seems so weird in our culture, that the blood was needed, like, let's say, for forgiveness or for reconciliation or kapar, atonement, something like that. It would take me an hour. So I would say you can read the book to get the quick version of that, or you can jump onto our Expedition 44 10-part atonement series, and you can really get the understanding of that. But you can kind of get more and more and more into these things. But let me just give you a quick understanding of, I think, the major ones in there. So yes,
Okay.
forgiveness is needed. I think everybody should be continually living in forgiveness. They did in the Old Testament, and I think we need to today. I think the number one reason for that is because that's how Jesus lived. That's what Jesus asks us to do, is to live in humble forgiveness. And it's, if you want to live in peace and shalom and in contentment with the Lord and people around you, that's a great tenet of forgiveness. Now, is it actually needed? I'm going to actually challenge you and most of the viewers to say that there isn't a lot of places in scripture where, when you get down to it, I'm not sure that you would say it's needed. It's
Hmm.
not necessary. It might not be necessary for salvation. Yet on the flip side of that, could you get to salvation without being asking for forgiveness? I'd have to say the answer to that is no. So it's a little complicated, a little circular back and forth. When you get into animal sacrifice in the Old Testament, like, again, the animal sacrifice and the blood is going to be connected on this conversation. So are those two things needed today? Well, I think most people know the answer to that is no. Would God want me to go my 4-H project for next month? Would God want me to go work on a goat and sacrifice, the goat to him right now? Well, I might get put in jail for that today, like, that comes off as very strange. Would it be okay for me to bring some of that goat blood home and sprinkle it around my house and my neighbor's house? That might get me into jail too. Like, it's so countercultural to what we know, but it was important for what it is, and it's still important today. Now, it's not important that I go sprinkle blood, but it's important that I understand the relationship between the life that God has designed for me and wants to reinstate me as a recreated spiritual being
Hmm.
in his image, that some of that was connected to the purity that was found in the blood. That my blood, who I am, has been defiled, and that the only way I can come back to be completely pure is to trade my blood for the blood of Jesus. And
Hmm.
some of you are tracking, some of you aren't, and I'm just going to have to say, like, I'm just going to cut myself off, or we're going to be here all day on that one.
No, that is really, really cool. I'm gonna have to revisit your series on the Atonement. That's really awesome stuff. Okay, all right. Yeah, that you basically covered it all I wanted to talk about here. So, yeah, point people to your book, Amazon, anywhere else. I everyone, I strongly recommend checking out Covenant Theological Seminary. I'm a student there. It's accredited. Lots of great classes and good resources. A lot you can learn from that. Uh, the book. Everyone, check out the book. Any last words, Dr. Ryan?
No, I just want to say thank you again for having me on. Zach, you're an inspiration. I just love your passion, your vigor, your young enthusiasm. I think you got a bright future. I love all of the stuff that you're doing. I can't believe some of the amazing people that you have. And so I'm going to cross market this interview. I'll send it out to our CTS people. I'll send it
Okay.
out to our big kind of Expedition 44 community on some of that. So if you're listening and you're not familiar with Zach or his channel, I'm going to say you need to spend some serious time watching some of the videos. I mean, I love some of the interviews that you have, and I really look at some of the things you do as really diving in incredibly deep, having conversations that, as your title kind of signifies, other people are afraid to have or afraid to talk about. And you're just very bold. And me, I truly believe that there are great answers to all the tough questions, sometimes maybe more than one great answer to some of those hard questions. And so I absolutely love it that you are on this great journey, and I can't point people in your direction anymore. I share your videos, as you know, all the time, and I'm constantly pointing people your way. And I think that you are just really involved in something that is incredible, really well done, and worthwhile. So keep it up.
Awesome. That's very kind words of you to say. Thank you for that. And obviously, same goes to you, except for not all of it, but most of it. Yeah, there you go. Um, anyways, all right. Thanks for you guys for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to both of our channels. I hope you guys have a good one. All right, that was been